3 years. That's how long the gaming industry has been telling you the dream was dying. Layoffs at Xbox, studios shutting down, big budget games releasing half finished. Everyone called it a video game winter. But here's what nobody's talking about. The thought didn't come from better graphics. It did not come from new studios. It came from AI. Baked right into the silicon of your next console. And it's changing everything about how games are built, played, and experienced. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Tanveer Talks, and I am Tanveer. If you're new here, glad you found us. If you've been following us a while, you already know what this is. We take the stuff happening in tech, gaming, and culture, and we actually dig into it. No hype cycle, no PR talking points, just an honest breakdown. It's May 2026, and the gaming industry is at an interesting point. For the last few years, the story has been about contractions, layoffs, canceled project, studio closing, but the data is starting to shift. And what's driving that shift is not what most people expected. It's not a breakout new franchise. It's not a studio comeback. It's artificial intelligence. Not as chatbot, not as content generator, but embedded directly into the chips inside your next console. So today we're going to be covering three things. The NPU arms between Sony and Xbox, what it actually means, why it matters beyond the spec select, right? The Nintendo, because the Switch 2 story has taken a turn that deserves a real conversation, and then something I haven't seen covered properly anywhere, the privacy angle on all this always on AI hardware sitting in your living room. And that one I think is generally important, All right, let's start with the hardware first. For the last two hardware generations, the console war was simple. You picked a side and each side was competing on raw power. More teraflops, more VRAM, bigger number wins. That era is over. That we are entering now is, the NPU era, where it's not about how many pixels your chip can push, but how smart it is about how it pushes them. And nobody's demonstrating this better right now than Sony and Microsoft. Let's start with Sony. Recent leaks from senior research scientists inside PlayStation's R&D divisions point to something they're calling PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, or PSSR. And the next iteration of this tech goes well beyond upscaling. What Sony is working toward is a full AI-powered frame generation. Here's what that means in like a plain language. Instead of your console's GPU rendering every single frame from scratch, an AI model is trained to predict what frames should look like and fill in the gaps. You render fewer frames, the AI invents the rest. And the result? Smooth, high fidelity, 60 frames per second path tracing. On hardware, that would have needed to be twice as powerful to do it in the old way. This is a fundamental shift. We're moving from brute force rendering to what the research community calls AI interpolations. The GPU becomes the partner to the NPU, not the star of the show. Microsoft is also making a similar pivot, just with their own flavor. They've been quietly building what insiders are calling a Project Helix. At its core is a custom AMD SoC that integrates what they're calling is FSR Diamond, an ML-driven upscaling technology, alongside something called neural texture compression. The interesting strategic detail here is, Microsoft, has been winding on its more general AI gaming assist, the co-pilot for consoles concept, redirecting that talent towards, rendering specific AI. They're hiring heavily from Microsoft's core AI division, pulling people who build large-scale ML infrastructures and redeploying them on making games look and run better. What you're seeing from both Sony and Microsoft is a convergence on the same idea. The future isn't a faster box, it's a smarter box, right? One that uses machine learning to close the gap between what the hardware can physically do and what your eyes perceive as real. And the long game here is interesting, The vision and both Sony and, Microsoft are pointing towards this is like a hardware agnostic future. The cloud handles, the heaviest computational lifting. Your local NPU handles the frame level intelligence, so the experience feels native and instant. No lag, no cloud gaming jam, the best of both worlds. Whether they execute on the vision is another question, but the blueprint is clear. If you're a developer right now, the skill set you need isn't just knowing how to optimize shaders. You need to understand how to build games that cooperate with on-device AI. Now let's pivot to Nintendo, because this one is generally fascinating and a little painful if you're a Switch fan. And the Switch 2 launched to historic numbers. People were excited. The hardware was moving, and then the demand fell off faster than expected over the holidays. So much so that by March 2026 this year, reports surfaced that Nintendo is cutting its US Switch 2 production by staggering 33%. They went from a target of 6 million units down to 4 million for the quarter. Now, 33% is not a small cut. That's the company saying we overestimated how many people were going to keep buying this thing. And the question is why? The answer, if you know, read the community discourse, is pretty consistent. The software isn't there. And this is the, Nintendo trap, that people forget about Bitcoin hardware cycle is just like, yes, there was like a big launch title a while. Pokemon Pokopia, which like shifted 2.2 million units in its 4 days. That's impressive. But after that, like the line has been like dominated by what people are calling like Switch 2 editions, which is like a slightly uncharitable, but also not entirely unfair way of saying. These are ports and enhanced versions of games you already played on the original Switch. Better resolutions, faster load times, some quality of life improvements, but nothing new. So, these were not like system sellers. So when you're asking families to spend $500 on a new console, in an economy where people are generally feeling the squeeze, it runs Breath of the Wild at 60 frames per second is not gonna cut it, and it's not a compelling pitch. Circana, formerly NPD, they track consumer behavior in gaming, recently ran a survey asking people why they, buy the consoles. Exclusive games came in like number one, cited by 41% respondent. That sounds strong, but, here's a detail that should make, Nintendo nervous. That number is down 8% from the year before. 8% in 1 year, what that tells you is like the gamers are increasingly aware that so many called, exclusive eventually land on PC and other platforms, and the perception of exclusivity is, weakening. And, when you combine with that economic pressure on hardware spending, you need games that people cannot get anywhere else and, cannot wait on. The mainline 3D Mario, the brand new Zelda hasn't made for the Switch one, Metroid, Donkey Kong, Nintendo has those franchises, right? They have the creative teams. They need to deploy them, they do deploy them soon, because the goodwill from a launch window can only carries you so far. And there's a broader lesson here that applies beyond Nintendo, right? The idea that you can sell hardware on specs alone or even on the promise of better experience is increasingly a challenge. People have more options than ever. PC gaming is accessible. Game Pass and PlayStation Plus put enormous back catalog at your fingertips. The barrier to just saying I'll wait has never been lower. The hardware has to be good, but the software has to be undeniable. That combination is the only thing that moves boxing in 2026. But real quick, before we get into the last segment, if you're getting value out of this, the most useful thing you can do right now is, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening from, even on YouTube, right? Reviews, especially make a real difference for an independent show. They help new people find it, and, they can only, they only take like 30 seconds. So, and I read every single one. So, all right, back into it, I want to like shift gears and talk about something that the mainstream gaming press is not giving nearly enough attention to, because every time someone writes about NPUs or our own device AI, the framing is almost uniformly positive. Faster, smarter, better for you. And I'm not saying that framing is wrong, but it's incomplete. These same chips that make your game look incredible are also enabling a category of always on. Ambient sensing that raises real questions about what your console knows about you. And who has access to that knowledge. Here's the pitch, from manufacturing, and it's not like, sounds like reasonable on the surface. By processing AI tasks locally on the NPU in your living room, we keep your data on your device instead of sending it to your server. That actually reduces the risk of a large scale data breach, but that's real, There's a, legitimate benefit, but here's the other side of that coin, And always on NPU means your console can run ambient sensing continuously and cheaply. Think about what looks like in a practice, right? Always listening voice assistant, real-time facial analysis, sold to you as like immersion feature that detects your emotional state to adjust game difficulty or music. Behavioral tracking that builds a profile of how you play, when you play, and how you react. And here's the regulatory gap, that I think is really underappreciated, because this data never leaves your device. It often falls outside the traditional privacy frameworks that regulators have built. Most of those frameworks, were designed around data transmission. If your data never moves, the law often don't apply. And that's a legal gray zone that, manufacturers know about and the regulators are only now starting to catch up to. There's also a human dimension here, that longitudinal research is starting to surface when people know or even suspect they're being continuously monitored. Even if the data never leaves the box, their behavior changes. They game differently. They're more self-conscious. The experience of play is altered. That might sound abstract, but I think, think about that. Gaming is fundamentally supposed to be a space where you can fail, experiment, and, self-conscious, If the hardware is watching your face while you play and adjusting based on your reaction, you introduced a layer of surveillance into what was supposed to be a private experience. I'm not saying like manufacturers are acting in bad faith. I'm saying the conversation about verifiable privacy, not just we promise this stays on device, but actual transparency, and the user control needs to be part of the hardware announcement cycle, not buried in in a terms of service document. As we move forward, 2027, hardware announcements, benchmarks for these companies shouldn't just be, frame rates and AI upscaling benchmarks. It should be, can you prove that the data stays where you say it stays? And does the user have real control over what those sensors collect? That's the conversation I want to see, and the gaming press needs to be the one actually asking it. So what do we actually take away from all of this? Let me give you my honest read. The industry is in a genuinely fascinating moment. The video game winter, the layoffs, the stalled investments, the post-pandemic hangover is like thawing. But the recovery isn't, being driven by things we expected. It's not bigger budgets. It's not new genres. It's AI at the hardware level. Reshaping what's even possible. Cloud gaming, which has been 5 years away for about 15 years, is finally projecting to cross from a $1.4 billion niche to an $18 billion market by 2030. And that's not a pipe dream anymore. The infrastructure, the local NPU tech, the business models are finally catching up to that vision. But the winners of this era aren't going to be the companies with the most teraflops. They're going to be the ones, who use AI to make games feel more human, more responsive, more personal, more alive, which also being transparent about how they do it. Nintendo needs to, deploy its franchises. Sony and Xbox need to prove their AI best in real titles, not just tech demos. And all three need to answer the privacy questions before regularly answer it for them. My advice, don't buy a console based on the spec sheet. Follow the library, follow the ecosystem, follow the developers, who are using these tools in creative ways. That's where the real next generation actually lives. I want to leave you with, a question, because I think this is one is worth sitting with. When it comes to an on-device AI in your console, are you okay with it? Because that data stays local, and is that enough for you? And does it not matter where the data lives? If the hardware is watching your face, logging how you behave, that's a line you're not crossing regardless. I generally want to know where you land on that. So drop it in the YouTube comments below and reply to me on X at PunjabiGamer786, right? And that's it. Thanks for spending time with me today. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Generally, if this episode gave you something to think about, the single best thing you can do for the show is leave a review. 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Podcast. It takes 30 seconds and it helps more people find Tanveer Talks. And subscribe if you haven't already, so don't miss the next one. Share this episode with someone who's into gaming or tech. That word of mouth matters more than any algorithms. Links are in the show notes. This is Tanveer Talks. See you in the next episode. Peace.